The snow was falling fast, blanketing the Vermont woods in icy silence, when the call came in. A young bobcat. Starving, broken, and out of time. Within 24 hours, he'd be gone. Forever. But what if one decision, made deep in a frozen valley by a retired vet with nothing to prove, could change that fate? This isn't just a rescue story. It's a quiet rebellion against giving up, against letting go. And what unfolds next might just melt the coldest winter in Juniper Ridge. The storm hit just after midnight. By dawn, the town of Juniper Ridge was buried under 18 inches of snow, the kind that blanketed the roads in silence and made the whole world feel paused. The forests surrounding the Vermont Valley were quiet, too quiet. Snow clung to every pine needle, every frozen branch, muffling sound and movement alike. Even the birds had gone still. At the edge of this frozen wilderness sat the Juniper Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. 3 weather-beaten buildings, connected by wooden walkways, their rooftops sagging under the weight of accumulated snow. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and something else, sterility and old hay. The kind that clings to vet scrubs and carries the quiet weight of helpless creatures brought in from the cold. Inside the main building, fluorescent lights flickered to life. Dr. Allison Green, the facilities director, hunched over her clipboard, steam rising from the black coffee in her thermos. She didn't pause long. Her breath fogged in the hallway. Insulation was spotty at best, and her boots echoed as she made her way to enclosure 3B. There, in the farthest corner of the wire mesh cell, lay a lynx, not prowling, not pacing, just lying still. He was about 18 months old, maybe 2. Tufted ears drooped, his short bob tail twitching faintly at the cold. His coat, normally thick with tawny underfur and flecked with bold black markings, was patchy and dull. He barely looked up when Allison arrived. No hiss, no growl, not even a blink. That, she thought, was worse than aggression. "Case 913-B, she whispered aloud, reading the faded label on the cage. Shadow. He'd been found 5 weeks earlier, curled up in the snow near a ski trail. No collar, no microchip, nothing but old scars on his legs, and the unmistakable signs of prolonged captivity. He hadn't hunted, didn't know how. He hadn't hidden from people, didn't think he needed to. They tried everything, fresh kills, live enrichment, even synthetic prey simulations. But Shadow wasn't responding. No fight, no flight. Just a slow surrender. She scribbled the date on the clipboard. Friday. Euthanasia was scheduled for Monday morning, and barring a miracle, there would be no change. Outside, the wind howled against the siding. A snowplow rumbled somewhere in the distance, scraping at roads that hadn't seen sunlight in days. Inside enclosure 3B, Shadow didn't move. But if Allison had known what was about to happen, if she'd known who was about to call, and what impossible choice that call would bring, she might have looked again, might have noticed the way his ear flicked ever so slightly, as if he too was waiting for something. Meet the lynx, Shadow. He was born in a cage. Maybe not literally, but close enough. Every behavior said so. Shadow didn't flinch at human voices. He didn't hide when boots echoed through the corridor. And worst of all, he didn't look afraid of people, only indifferent. It was the kind of indifference that came from being seen as an object, touched too often, confined too long. North American bobcats, Lynx rufus, aren't built for cages. They're made for wide forests and jagged cliffs, for the silence of snowfall and the sharp snap of mouse bones beneath their jaws. They're solitary, territorial, and wildly elusive. But Shadow didn't stalk or mark or pace. He didn't do anything except exist. Dr. Green had named him Shadow, more out of poetic hope than accuracy. She'd wanted the name to mean stealth, mystery, a creature born of dusk and pine. But over the past 5 weeks, it had taken on a different meaning. He was the shadow of a lynx, a ghost of the wild. His intake records were thin. A ski patrol ranger had found him just outside Jay Peak, slumped in a ditch near the maintenance road. His fur had been clumped and dirty, his weight dangerously low. No signs of injury, just slow starvation, extreme muscle atrophy, and the distinctive symptoms of long-term captivity. The assumption was simple. He'd been kept illegally as a pet, then dumped when the novelty wore off. Tests confirmed it. Shadow had no parasites, no diseases, no reason, physically, not to recover. But he wouldn't. He ate only the bare minimum to survive. He never explored his space, never touched the enrichment tools. Other animals reacted to stimuli. He didn't react to anything. Volunteers had stopped entering his enclosure weeks ago. "He doesn't care," one of them had said. "It's like he's already gone." But that wasn't quite true. Dr. Green had watched his eyes, the amber gold irises dull from weeks of depression. And she had seen something flicker once or twice. A single blink of recognition when the wind carried the scent of pine. A twitch of his ear at the sound of a passing bird. He wasn't gone. He was waiting. But for what? The question lingered in the back of Allison's mind as she stood outside the mesh and watched him curl into himself again, paws tucked beneath his sunken frame. She knew the policies, knew the deadlines. 3 more days. And then they would sedate him, gently, quietly. No one would watch. No one would remember. Unless someone intervened. Unless the story changed. Back in her office, she picked up the phone. She didn't know why, not yet, but something in her chest told her this case didn't want to close. She dialed a number she hadn't used in years. A couple known not for dramatic rescues, but for impossible patience. 2 rings. Then, a familiar voice answered. "This is Caleb." Caleb Hartman. Caleb Hartman had learned a long time ago that real rescue didn't come with fanfare. It came in the dead of winter, under gray skies and frozen roofs, when no one was watching. He didn't wear a badge anymore, or a stethoscope. Just a thick flannel coat, thermal gloves, and boots worn down from years of trudging through snowbanks and muddy enclosures. At 62, Caleb had the look of a man who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. His skin was lined like a weather map, eyes pale blue and constantly scanning, never idle. His hair had gone white around the temples, and his beard had followed suit. But his movements remained methodical, steady. There was a kind of strength in him, not loud or aggressive, but unshakable. He and his wife, Mary, had settled in Waterbury Hollow 5 years earlier, a quiet bowl of land nestled between Vermont's Green Mountains. What was supposed to be retirement turned, almost inevitably, into something else. The barn on their property had become a sanctuary, not officially licensed as a zoo or a center, but an approved haven for a handful of unreleasable animals. An owl with a broken wing, a 3-legged fox, a raccoon too habituated to humans. Caleb didn't call it a refuge. He called it making do. Mary had once been a wildlife field technician, quick-footed, sharp-tongued, and fearless, with anything covered in fur. She had an uncanny way of getting animals to trust her, even the prickliest ones. These days, she spent more time gardening or fixing up the house. But when Allison Green's name lit up their caller ID, Mary's eyes narrowed like a cat spotting movement in the tall grass. Caleb took the call on speakerphone, leaning against the kitchen counter. "It's a bobcat," Allison explained. "About 2 years old. No microchip, no history. Emaciated, psychologically withdrawn. Doesn't respond to stimuli." "Is he aggressive?" Caleb asked. "No," she replied. "Worse. He doesn't care." The line went quiet. Caleb glanced at Mary. She was already pulling a legal pad toward her, scribbling notes. Allison continued, more hesitant now. "He's scheduled for euthanasia Monday. I know it's late, I know it's asking a lot. Why call us? Caleb asked. Because he's not sick. He's just not awake. Caleb didn't respond right away. He stared out the frost-laced window. Snow was falling again. Light. Swirling flakes that danced through the gray morning. He'd seen this before. Animals hollowed out by bad captivity. Bodies that healed faster than minds. But some part of him, a part dulled by years of hard choices, still stirred. "Send me the file," he said. Mary didn't smile. She didn't need to. They both knew what came next. The unexpected call. By the time Allison's email arrived with Shadow's full case file, the sun had dipped behind the mountains and the wind was beginning to howl again, rattling the shutters of the Hartman's farmhouse. Caleb sat in his study with a yellow desk lamp, casting a soft glow across weathered papers, anatomical charts, and a decades-old veterinary license framed but dusty. The file was worse than he expected. Shadow weighed just over 18 pounds, 10 below normal for a male bobcat his age. His blood work showed signs of prolonged starvation, though his organs were still functioning within acceptable ranges. Photos taken during intake showed a gaunt figure, curled into a tight ball, eyes glassy and unseeing. Behavior logs painted a bleak picture. No reaction to toys, no interest in food while watched, and an eerie lack of territorial instinct. Caleb leaned back, fingers laced behind his head, and sighed. He'd seen animals like this before, survivors in name only. But something didn't add up. "Take a look at this," he called out. Mary joined him at the desk, mug of tea in hand. Her eyes scanned the data, then narrowed on one particular note buried at the bottom of a volunteer's log. He flinched at the sound of snow falling off the roof. "See that?" Caleb said. Mary nodded slowly. "That's instinct. Something buried deep." "He's not dead inside," Caleb muttered. "Just buried." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that came from years of shared decisions. Outside, the barn light flickered on, triggered by a motion sensor, probably the owl moving in its enclosure. "You're thinking about taking him," Mary said, not as a question. "I'm thinking we have space. I'm thinking the quarantine unit's empty. I'm thinking—" He paused. "What if we just give him a chance to decide for himself?" Mary's eyes softened. She walked to the window and looked out at the falling snow. "If we do this, we go slow. No expectations." "No timelines," Caleb agreed. "No names yet," she added. "Not until he earns one." Caleb smiled faintly. "Fair." He picked up the phone and dialed. Allison answered on the first ring. "Can you get him here by Friday?" he asked simply. The relief in her voice was immediate. "We'll start prepping the transport. Thank you, Caleb. Truly." He hung up, turned to Mary, and rolled his shoulders back with the quiet weight of a decision made. They weren't looking for redemption. They weren't looking to be heroes. But something about this broken animal, found half dead in a ditch and too quiet for the world to notice, something about him felt unfinished. And sometimes Caleb had learned, all an animal needed wasn't a rescue, just a place to wait until they were ready to try again. Turning point in week 3. The snow hadn't let up in over a week. Waterbury Hollow was buried under a white hush that dampened sound and slowed everything down. The road to the Hartman's farmhouse had become a single plowed line between walls of snow, nearly 4 feet high. It was the kind of winter that demanded patience. From people, from animals, from life itself. Shadow had been in quarantine for 19 days. Every morning, Caleb would bring a tray of raw rabbit and quail into the barn. Every evening, Mary would sit near the enclosure, speaking softly or reading aloud, never pushing too close. Shadow remained distant, cautious, but not hostile. He'd begun eating in their presence, which was progress, but he still curled up in the farthest corner, when anyone moved too quickly. Caleb knew better than to rush wild things. He'd worked with lynx before, mountain cats with more silence in their bones than noise. But this was different. Shadow didn't act wild. He acted numb. And yet, something had shifted. On the 21st evening, Mary was knitting beside the enclosure, the needles clicking softly as a fire crackled in the old cast-iron stove nearby. She wasn't talking, just humming, an old Scottish lullaby her grandmother used to sing when the snow came early. Her scarf was half done, the yarn a deep pine green that matched the trees now hidden beneath the storm outside. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a movement. Shadow had stood up. He hadn't moved like that in days. Not to approach, not to investigate. But now he took 2 cautious steps forward, ears forward, eyes fixed, not on her, but on her hands. He was watching the knitting needles, the rhythm, the movement, the sound. Mary froze. She didn't look at him directly, knew better than to challenge him with eye contact, but kept knitting, heart thumping. Her voice came low, instinctive. "It's just yarn," she whispered. "Nothing sharp, nothing chasing you." Shadow stepped closer. His paws made no sound on the straw-lined floor. He wasn't stalking. He was curious. His amber eyes were brighter than before, still guarded, but no longer empty. He sat down, just 6 feet away, and stayed. That was the night Mary didn't read, didn't talk. She just hummed and knitted, and Shadow watched. And neither of them moved for nearly an hour. When Caleb peeked in through the barn window and saw the 2 of them, woman and Bobcat, bathed in lamplight and firelight and silence, he didn't interrupt. He just nodded to himself. The thaw had begun. Not in the weather, not yet, but in something older, deeper, something buried inside that lynx's heart. And from that night forward, things would never be the same. The big decision. By the 4th week, Shadow had begun to follow a rhythm, his own rhythm. Every morning he waited near the front of the enclosure when Caleb entered, not pacing, just present. He still didn't allow touch, but his body language had changed. His tail was looser, his ears no longer pinned. At night, he sat closer to Mary, alert but calm, his amber eyes no longer hollow. He began using the space, climbing the wooden shelves they'd installed, pawing at leaf bundles Caleb brought from the woods, even pouncing once at a dangling length of rope. It wasn't graceful. His muscles were still rebuilding, and his instincts came in flashes instead of steady streams. But there was energy now, purpose. That's when the conversation began. "We need to talk about next steps," Mary said one evening, arms folded as she watched Shadow play with a pine cone. Caleb didn't answer right away. He was leaning against the barn door, chewing on the edge of his glove. He knew what she meant. The plan had always been temporary, stabilization, then transfer. Wildcare, the large sanctuary across the border in New Hampshire, had already offered a place for Shadow. It was a respected facility, with professional handlers and space to roam. A safe place. "He could be there by next week," Caleb said finally. "He could," Mary replied. "But—" The pause was heavy. Caleb looked at her. "You don't think it's right?" Mary shook her head slowly. "He's not ready for crowds, for handlers, for a rotation of new smells and schedules. He's bonded to this place, to us." Caleb sighed. "He's not a pet." "I know. He's not fully wild either." "I know that too." They stood in silence, both watching as Shadow stretched out in a patch of sunlight, his sides rising and falling slowly. The scars on his legs were healing. His coat was fuller. He looked settled. "He comes to the fence when he hears your voice," Mary said softly. "He won't eat unless I'm nearby. That's not accident. That's choice." "But choice means responsibility," Caleb said. "Long term, permits, renovations, daily care, emergency plans. You ready to commit to that again? Mary turned to face him, arms still crossed but eyes clear. I never stopped being ready. Caleb looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Shadow, who, at that exact moment, glanced up and met his gaze for the first time with no fear in his eyes. "All right," Caleb said, voice quiet but sure. "We do it right. No shortcuts. We file for permanent custody, upgrade the enclosure, work with the wildlife board." Mary exhaled slowly, and for the first time in weeks, allowed herself a full smile. Shadow yawned, stretched his limbs like a cat in the sun, and curled up again. This was no longer a holding stop. This was becoming home. First contact. By the time the last icicles were starting to drip from the eaves of the barn roof, the rhythm of Shadow's life had become nearly predictable. Caleb brought the food. Mary brought the quiet. Shadow brought presence. It wasn't obvious, not to an outsider, but to those who had watched him spend his first days curled into corners, ignoring the world. Even standing was progress. Movement was a miracle, and presence, his deliberate act of choosing to be near, was a revelation. It was late afternoon when the moment finally arrived. Mary had just finished checking on the kestrel in the smaller aviary and was walking back toward the barn with her usual tray for Shadow. Raw quail, a few feathers bundled together with twine, and a sprig of fresh pine she'd clipped from the woods. Not for food, for scent. Something to remind him of a world that once belonged to him. She didn't expect anything new that day. She never did. The best way to coax progress from a broken animal was to ask nothing, demand nothing, expect nothing. Just be. She opened the barn door slowly. The fire in the wood stove was burning low, casting a warm glow across the straw-covered floor. Shadow was curled on the top platform of the structure Caleb had built, half a tree trunk, half a cat tower, all weathered wood and smooth edges. His eyes followed her, but didn't narrow. His ears twitched once, not in alarm, just in acknowledgement. She placed the tray on the flat stone shelf near the gate and backed away. That was when it happened. A sound, low, rumbling, not a growl, not a warning, a vibration. Mary stopped. Slowly, she turned her head, not enough to stare, just enough to glance. Shadow was on his feet. Not crouched, not defensive. Standing fully upright, tail neutral, head high. He walked toward the tray. But halfway there, he paused, right at the edge of the enclosure where Mary still stood, holding her breath. He looked directly at her, for the first time, really looked. Then he stepped closer. His paws made no sound on the straw, but the pressure in the moment was deafening. Mary didn't speak, didn't move. She simply extended her hand, slowly, through the wire mesh, palm outward, fingers still. Shadow paused inches from it. He sniffed once, then again. Then, in a gesture so deliberate it made Mary's heart stutter, he pressed the side of his face, just barely, against the back of her fingers. Not for long, 2 seconds, maybe 3. But it was enough. She didn't exhale until he pulled away and returned to the tray, eating in slow, deliberate bites. But even as he ate, he kept one eye on her, not out of suspicion, but out of recognition. That night, Mary couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the moment in her head, the warmth of his fur, the press of his cheek, the steady gaze. She knew better than to anthropomorphize it, to cast it in human emotion. But she also knew what she'd felt. Trust. The next evening, she brought her knitting instead of the usual journal. She sat near the enclosure, humming softly, letting her hands move rhythmically. Shadow approached again, this time stopping just a few feet away and sitting down. He watched the needles click, the yarn loop, the pattern form. He tilted his head as if trying to understand. She hummed louder, the same lullaby from 2 weeks ago. And then, another surprise, he chirped. A short, breathy sound from deep in his chest. Not quite a meow, not a call. Just contact. After 3 nights, he began to wait for her. By the time Caleb joined her in the barn on the 5th evening, Shadow was already on the platform closest to the gate, tail curled neatly around his front paws. He didn't hide. He didn't retreat. "He knows your rhythm," Caleb said quietly. "He knows I won't hurt him," Mary replied, not looking away. "He knows I'll be here." They didn't try to touch him again. Not yet. What mattered more was that he came. And kept coming. Within 10 days, Shadow's behavior had changed entirely. He explored the enclosure thoroughly now, climbing, sniffing, rubbing his face along the edges of logs and shelves. He chased the feather toy once, startling himself when it moved too fast, then coming back to pounce again. He didn't pace, he didn't hide. He began grooming himself regularly, his coat thickening, his gait surer. And every evening at the same time, he sat near Mary's stool, eyes fixed on her hands, ears twitching at the sound of her voice. "He's recalibrating," Caleb said, one night as they reviewed the daily log. "He's coming back," Mary said more simply. But she didn't mean his body. That had begun healing weeks ago. She meant the self that had been buried, the part of him that had been locked away by fear, neglect, and silence. The part that, finally, had found reason to return. It was never about saving him. It was about showing him he was safe. That night, as snow fell silently outside and the wind curled around the eaves, Mary sat beside the enclosure, knitting slowly, quietly, with Shadow just a foot away. She didn't reach out again. She didn't need to. He was already choosing to stay. New life patterns. By the time spring crept over Waterbury Hollow, the snow had thinned to patches, and the air carried the faint scent of wet earth and pine sap. Trees stretched skyward, their bare branches tinged with early green, and the hills hummed with melting water. But in the Hartman household, the most remarkable change wasn't in the landscape. It was in the quiet transformation of a once broken animal, now reclaiming his place in the world. Shadow had been with Caleb and Mary for just over 3 months. The barn was no longer just a holding unit. They'd expanded it, adding a covered outdoor run with reinforced fencing, high platforms, scratching logs, and a dozen shaded corners. Caleb had installed viewing slats so Shadow could see into the woods, track deer movements, and study the wind. Mary had set up a rotation of natural scents, cedar, foxfur, feathers, encouraging his hunting instincts. And Shadow responded. Each morning began with a patrol. He would climb the tallest perch, scan the yard like a sentinel, then stretch out under the eaves, where the sun first touched the wood. He was growing, stronger, heavier, his coat sleek and brushed with darker contrast. His ears twitched constantly, listening, calculating. His eyes, once dim, now gleamed with alertness. But the most telling sign of his growth was choice. He chose to come near. He chose to stay close when Mary arrived with food, brushing against the wire in slow, deliberate greeting. He chirped, soft, guttural sounds that only bobcats made, when Caleb played his harmonica in the evenings. On colder nights, he curled in his heated den box, but on milder ones, he slept atop the old cedar beam, legs dangling, body loose, and content. Roscoe, their border collie, was the first of the household animals to take interest in Shadow. For weeks, they watched each other through barriers. Roscoe wagging his tail curiously. Shadow crouched, calculating. But there was no aggression, only curiosity. Eventually, Mary allowed brief interactions across a secure mesh divider, and something unexpected began to form. Not quite friendship, but a tolerance that hinted at potential. "He's not just surviving anymore," Mary said one evening, notebook in hand. "He's building a life." Caleb watched Shadow leap effortlessly from beam to platform, tail flicking. "He's rebuilding one," he corrected gently. It was a delicate balance. They never forgot what Shadow was: a wild animal. Not a pet, not domesticated. Every routine was done with caution, every interaction on Shadow's terms. But what made it remarkable was that, despite his history, he'd chosen not to disappear into the silence. He'd chosen to trust. And in turn, the Hartmans chose to give him the freedom to do so. Their days followed the rhythm of his world now, of seasons, scents, sounds that mattered only to the wild. And though it was quiet, and often went unnoticed by the outside world, it was, by every measure that counted, a triumph, integration, and acceptance. The day the fence gate opened was unceremonious, quiet, and entirely intentional. Caleb unlatched the interior partition of Shadow's enclosure, stepping back slowly as the Bobcat paused on the other side, golden eyes scanning the gap. No fanfare, no coaxing, just the choice. Shadow took one step forward, then another, his movements fluid and cautious, like smoke slipping through cracks in a wall. He entered the open side of the compound, a connected space to the rear yard, still enclosed, still secure, but wide enough to feel like freedom. Mary watched from the porch, wrapped in a heavy knit shawl. "He's different today," she murmured. "He's deciding," Caleb replied. Shadow's integration into the wider world of the Hartman property wasn't sudden. It came in stages, like the melt of spring ice, slow, steady, and natural. At first, it was only short visits to the larger outdoor run. Then exploration of the new tree perch network Caleb built across the enclosure. Then proximity to Roscoe, who would sit just outside the fencing, ears perked, body relaxed. One late afternoon, Roscoe broke routine. He dropped his favorite chew toy just beyond the fence, close to where Shadow lay resting. Shadow watched it for a long time, then rose, unhurried, unthreatened, and approached. He sniffed the toy, tapped it with one paw, then backed away. It was enough. From that point on, a subtle trust formed between predator and herding dog, based not on play or affection, but respect. Roscoe would accompany Mary during feedings. Shadow would watch from a distance, sometimes approaching, sometimes not. They moved like two orbiting stars, each within view of the other, yet never colliding. The real moment of acceptance came on a rainy April morning. Mary was late delivering Shadow's food, caught up, tending to the injured kestrel that had arrived the night before. When she finally stepped out with the meal in hand, Shadow was already waiting, not by the enclosure, but at the edge of the inner fence, soaked but calm. And when Roscoe joined them, trotting to Mary's side with a bark, Shadow didn't retreat. Instead, he chirped, a short, low sound, and sat down. A greeting, a signal. That evening, Caleb recorded the behavior in his log. Shadow approached voluntarily, no signs of stress, demonstrated recognition of human and canine, marking shift in psychological state, attachment versus tolerance. They knew he could never return to the wild, not truly. He'd been broken too early, imprinted too deeply. But here, in the quiet edges of a forested town, Shadow wasn't a relic of someone's bad decision. He wasn't a problem to solve. He was part of something, a rhythm, a home. Neighbors eventually learned of the Bobcat on the Hartman property, and questions followed. Gentle curiosity, concern, even skepticism. But when they saw how calm he was, how structured and thoughtful the Hartman's care had been, skepticism gave way to something else: respect. Not for the spectacle, but for the patience it took to let a wild heart mend itself. 1 year later, reflection and legacy. New normal. 12 months passed. What began as a last-minute reprieve had become something permanent, a rhythm that neither Caleb nor Mary could have predicted, yet had somehow come to define their days. Shadow was no longer a case file or a temporary charge. He was family. Not in the way of dogs curled at one's feet or cats warming windowsills, but in the way certain wild things settle in the bones of a place, claiming space without surrendering their nature. The seasons had turned twice. Snow had melted into mud, which hardened into golden summer dust. Leaves had burned crimson and then fallen. And now, as winter crept back down from the hills, Shadow watched it come from his perch atop the outer shelter's roof, head high, ears swiveling, breath visible in the icy dawn. Mary stood at the kitchen window, steaming mug in hand, her eyes following his every movement. "He knows this land now," she said softly. Caleb joined her. "He belongs here." They had made changes. The enclosure had tripled in size. Shade structures, climbing ramps, and a heated den box were all a part of Shadow's territory. A motion-activated door allowed him to come into the sunroom, a space modified with scratch-safe flooring, custom ledges, and secure barriers that allowed him to see the house without stepping into it. He came inside most evenings, and every night at precisely 8:45, he leapt onto the bench by the fire, curling up with that same dignified grace that reminded everyone. He was still wild, just home. He'd never been aggressive, never once shown a flash of claws toward the Hartmans or Roscoe, who now spent most afternoons lying on the other side of the mesh wall. Their connection remained subtle, more like mutual acknowledgement than affection. But even that was extraordinary. Visitors still came, carefully screened wildlife officers, students from the vet college, and the occasional neighbor who asked gently if it was true that a bobcat lived in the yard. But those visits were managed tightly. Shadow's world had boundaries, and Caleb ensured they were respected. He kept meticulous logs, blood work, behavior notes, enrichment schedules. Every bit of data mattered, not only for Shadow's health, but for the legal and ethical precedent they were slowly helping to set. Shadow was more than a rehabilitation success. He was a case study in long-term, non-releasable care done right. "We didn't save him," Caleb had said once, during a phone call with a skeptical reporter. "We just didn't give up. That's different." What had emerged from that quiet persistence was a truth deeper than science or policy, that healing isn't always about returning to what was. Sometimes it's about learning to belong in what is. And for Shadow, this place, this snowy, pine-wrapped corner of Vermont, wasn't a cage. It was his territory, his sanctuary, his home. The fire in the Hartman's living room crackled softly, casting a flickering glow across the hardwood floor. Outside, snow fell in slow, lazy spirals, dusting the pine trees and fence posts in silent white. Inside, warmth and quiet filled the air, a peace hard-earned and deeply treasured. Shadow lay curled on his favorite bench by the fire. His breath rose and fell steadily, golden eyes half closed, ears twitching only when the wind howled across the roof. He had become part of this home not through ownership or obedience, but through presence, consistency, and a bond no one had dared expect. Mary sat on the couch, her knitting in her lap, unfinished. She was watching him. "You remember," she said softly, "when he first touched my hand? I think that was the moment I stopped waiting for him to change." Caleb, across the room, looked up from his book. "Because you saw that he already had." Mary nodded, smiling gently. "I saw he didn't need to be wild to be whole. Just needed a place where he didn't have to be afraid." Outside, Roscoe padded past the window, nose to the ground, tail wagging in short, confident strokes. He paused near the enclosure door, gave a short bark and waited. Shadow's ears perked. He uncurled slowly, stretching long limbs and yawning. Then, with practiced grace, He hopped off the bench and moved to the door. A few seconds later, Caleb opened it, just enough for Shadow to slip out into the enclosed yard. He and Roscoe touched noses briefly, an almost ritual exchange now, before settling into their usual spots beneath the overhang, side by side, but not touching. The wind whispered through the trees. Inside, Mary whispered, "Do you think he knows?" Caleb looked up. "Knows what?" That he was supposed to die that day, that the call from the sanctuary, that we almost missed him. Caleb closed his book slowly. "I think he knows something changed, that he's safe now. That's enough." They sat in silence for a while, watching the snow thicken outside. Then Mary rose, walked to the door, and opened it a crack. Shadow glanced up at her from his perch beside Roscoe, and for a moment, their eyes locked. She didn't speak, she just held his gaze. And Shadow, in a gesture that still brought tears after all this time, blinked slowly. Not fear, not submission, but trust. He turned back to the snow, lifting his face into the falling flakes, as if savoring the world that had almost slipped away. Behind him, Roscoe wagged his tail. Behind the glass, two people watched, not from ownership or pride, but from awe. Shadow wasn't a pet, he wasn't a symbol. He was a survivor, and as the snow continued to fall and the fire warmed the room behind him, one truth settled over the house like the evening frost. Sometimes, the wild doesn't need to be tamed. Sometimes it just needs a place to breathe. And a reason to stay. Shadow's story reminds us that healing doesn't always follow a straight path, and sometimes it doesn't look like recovery at all. Sometimes, healing means building a life around broken pieces, finding peace not by returning to what was, but by accepting what is and choosing to move forward anyway. In our fast-paced world, it's easy to overlook the quiet power of patience, of presence, of simply staying with someone or something long enough for trust to take root. Whether it's a wounded animal, a struggling friend, or even ourselves, the truth remains. What we give our time and care to, we help rebuild. At Paw Prints Stories, we believe that every creature has a story, and every story has the power to teach us something real. So here's your quiet challenge. What in your life needs your patience, not your judgment? What broken part of the world might